Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
No tax rises for 95% of earners, more money for the NHS and social care, and scrapping tuition fees. These were some of Jeremy Corbyn's promises as he launched the Labour Party Manifesto earlier, saying the policies in it were for the many, not the few.
These are some of the key announcements then. Jeremy Corbyn pledged his party will nationalise the railways, the energy sector and the Royal Mail. On taxation, no income tax rises for those earning less than £80,000 a year, and no VAT or national insurance rises either, but there would be increases for those who earn more than £80,000 a year.
Labour would scrap the Conservative government's white paper plans on Brexit, and there would be an extra £6 billion a year for the NHS. While the triple lock on state pensions would be guaranteed.
You stole my line. Now, the economist and former government advisor Vicky Bryce joins us now. Vicky Bryce, a very good afternoon to you. I know we'd originally booked you on to talk about inflation, so let's get that out of the way, shall we? Inflation, CPI, rose from 2.3% to 2.7%, according to the latest figures. Bank of England's got a target of 2%. How much of a headache is this for the government?
Well, the real problem is, of course, that it's likely to be affecting household consumption. That's already been evident in retail sales. We've seen that in the last few months. But with wages rising by less than that, what is going on right now is that real disposable incomes are falling, which is a funny time to be going into election with that actually happening on the background. Yeah,
Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, said last week that we are in for a more challenging time because of those falling real wages. But the Bank of England, I think, also suggested that 2.7% for CPI might be the peak, at least for now.
Well, it might be. On the other hand, I think that quite a lot of what's been going on, particularly because of the fall in the pound, in terms of anyone being able to pass prices through to the final consumer, that has been very slow. So the suppliers have been hit by very substantial increases in input costs, sometimes valued at around sort of 17 to 20%. So quite a large increase in what they have to pay for the things that go into the production process and also for the manufactured products that they import. They have not been passing that through, with the result that over the next few months they will be doing so, unless we expect them all to go bust, of course. So the expectation is therefore that inflation will rise and will rise further, and the 2.7% that we've seen now may actually not be the end. There are loads of predictions out there that will go over 3%.
I think you've already hinted at this, but it's worth labouring the point. The idea of entering an election when real wages are falling, if you look back across the post-war history of elections, it's very, very rare for a governing party to go into an election with that kind of economic backdrop.
It's absolutely true. But of course, what's going on right now is that the consumer is focusing very much on essentials. So they're buying the petrol for their cars. The good thing is that, of course, petrol prices have come down a little bit at the pumps in the last month. But what you're also seeing is that food prices are rising, which is quite a worry for most people. So what they're doing is they're postponing buying white goods or anything else which is non-essential and focusing very much on the stuff that they absolutely need. So there is a squeeze going on. So everyone will be looking at the manifestos with great interest to see, is there going to be some relief? Are we going to be getting perhaps, some favourable treatment in terms of taxes or increases in the personal allowance, that sort of stuff that might make a difference. But remember, we've also having benefits being cut. So we are talking about people being squeezed and haven't been squeezed already for quite some time and likely to be squeezed more in the coming years.
I suppose the government could say, at least in the medium term, that the relative rise in sterling's value recently will mean that some of those input costs will start to moderate. OK, you won't feel it before the election's done and dusted, but perhaps by the end of the year you might start to see inflation responding to sterling's rise.
Well, that's true. It depends, of course, how long it lasts. I think what the markets have assumed is that because of the likelihood of a big Conservative majority, we might, in fact, be having a softer Brexit than was suggested earlier. So, and therefore, that will mean faster growth. But on the inflation front directly, the interesting thing is that oil prices have started going up again. We've had the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries now suggesting that they will keep the output cut for longer. So that's already happening, of course, in the markets. We've had commodity prices generally going up too, and food prices that I mentioned. So although, yes, perhaps there may be some relief from the slightly higher exchange rate against the dollar in particular, we've now weakened against the euro, for example, from where loads of manufacturing exports are coming.
From an economist's perspective, let's just turn to Labour's manifesto today. They say it's been thoroughly costed. What's your sense of it?
We've heard the figures, seen the figures, and indeed I think they are expecting to have quite substantial tax increases on which to base some of the spending that they intend to do. But remember, the first thing is, of course, corporation tax. That is expected to raise about 20 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. Now, of course, that can all disappear if companies' profits are affected negatively, or if people just move business out of the UK. And of course, with Brexit, you just never know what will happen in the future. Income tax increases, again, that doesn't always lead to more collections of income tax. Of course, there's also the stamp duty, or rather the financial transactions tax, which again may all disappear if transactions don't happen in this country but move to Singapore, say. So I think some of the tax base is quite unclear. On the other hand, the country does need some extra investment. There is no doubt about that. And for that, there is always allowance to borrow more. And as we know, the government can still borrow at very, very low rates, in fact, negative rates at times. So it's not a daft idea at all. The only question is what happens on the current side, current spending, if some of the tax revenues that they're expecting just don't materialise.
The percentage of tax as a proportion of GDP, I think, is already at a 25-year high. What could it go to?
Well, the forecast, I've been hearing what the Institute for Fiscal Studies has been saying, it will be almost the highest ever, certainly since the war. So that would be quite a shock in terms of the economy itself. But the question, of course, is how you balance it out and who ends up sort of paying. And we talk a lot about the squeezed middle and the ordinary working people. In reality, they are the people who pay 45% of the sort of income tax. And if you really want to have more tax on people, that they are unfortunately the ones you should focus on. So the tax rate will be going up across, but the tax take may not.
Vicky Price, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot.
Well, our economics editor, Ed Conway, has been looking at how Labour's numbers add up. Ed?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I mean, you know, this has been a long-awaited manifesto. We had some details, didn't we, leaked last week. But it's rather interesting looking into the actual document itself, a bit longer than anyone really expected, 128 pages. And in fairness to Labour, you know, there's been a lot of scrutiny about whether their numbers add up. They have provided quite a lot of detail about where those figures come from. So look here, they're talking about the manifesto being fully costed with all current spending paid for out of taxation or redirected revenue streams. Now, the key the word to note there is current spending. You've got current spending, the stuff that you're spending on salaries, for instance, for nurses, the stuff, the day-to-day spending, the work of the government. Now, that is going to be covered by the extra taxes raised by Labour. What's not covered are the enormous potential costs of things like extending HS2 up into Scotland or indeed Crossrail 2 and these other big projects they have in mind. But with that borne in mind, let's move on to their funding document. And they have provided a complete document with all of their numbers in it. Now, they should be applauded for that. Most parties don't tend to include, you know, even a smattering of detail, whereas in Labour's case, they have provided quite big amounts of it, big tables on how much each thing is going to cost. You could ask questions about some of these numbers. So these are their spending commitments. Let's go through them a little bit. You've got schools. Actually, the vast majority of the spending is on schools, with £11.2 billion on the reversal of tuition fees, so getting rid of tuition fees. But also you've got things like childcare, more money for Sure Start, more money for school funding. We talked about that last week. You've got healthcare. We talked about this yesterday, £5 billion for the NHS. Now, when you're going through these numbers, we're talking about relatively big numbers, but not absolutely terrifying, enormous numbers. And as I've said, you could quibble with some of them. So, for instance, we looked, didn't we, at additional police officers. So they're talking about that costing £300 million a year, £0.3 billion a year. Our sums suggested it would be a little bit more than that, so there are some big question marks over whether these numbers fully add up. But all in all, and by the way, when they talk about Barnett consequentials here, that means for all of these policies, whether it's schools, hospitals, etc., where the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have their own control of them, that money needs to be accounted for separately to go up there. So that's £6 billion. The total that they're talking about by 2021 to 22 is an extra £48.6 billion of current spending, and they say that they're going to raise taxes to try to account for that. The big rise is going to be corporation tax, up by 19.4 billion in terms of the amount it raises. That's raising it up to 26% for corporations. Some people would say you're not going to get as much money as that because companies will move their cash overseas. We will have to see. There's the tax increases for the top 5%. By the way, that means if you're earning over £80,000, you will be paying more tax. The 45p rate, that used to apply for anyone earning over 150,000. That goes down to 80,000. There's a new tax rate at 123,000. And a few other things. Avoidance, that's a big one. You can always bring in a bit more money for avoidance. VAT on private school fees. And it brings the total to, you guessed it, exactly the same as the spending. Now, that is, I'd say, you know, you could quibble a little bit over the numbers, but they're not massively off. Where there is a big question mark is this. There's a little paragraph here about something they call the National Transformation Fund. Now, this is what they're using to spend to pay for all of the really big projects, the nationalisations that they're talking about, bringing Crossrail into London, bringing another Crossrail in the north, enormous rail projects. You've got Crossrail for the north, new Brighton Main Line. It goes on and on and on. Now, this is going to cost tens of billions of pounds. Labour has said they will pay for this kind of stuff, so investment out of borrowing. That's fair enough, but it's worth bearing in mind. An extra £250 billion worth of borrowing, which it could well be for this. They're talking about their big investment fund. That will raise the national debt an awful lot. And it will mean that although the current spending won't be paid for out of taxpayers' pockets, this stuff will be paid for by future generations because more debt has to be paid off eventually.
Ed, thanks very much.
Let's bring in Paul Johnson then from the Institute for Fiscal Studies to see if it all makes sense. Paul Johnson, very good afternoon to you. Broadly speaking, over the course of the next Parliament, they say they would raise revenue of 50 billion and spend the same. Does that sound realistic to you?
Well, the first thing to say is those are both very big numbers indeed. And if you could raise that amount of extra tax, that would take the tax burden to its highest level in many decades. The scale of the spending increases, you've got 10 billion or more in terms of getting rid of tuition fees at universities. You've got quite a lot of billions on other elements of education, 5 billion for childcare, and on. So that adds up to a lot. And then actually on top of the 50 billion you mentioned, there's another 25 billion on investment spending. On the tax side, they're relying, as you said, to some extent on taxing people earning more than 80,000 a year, but much the biggest part of their tax increases is tax increases on companies. And I think the real uncertainty there is that whether you can really get that many tens of billions from companies without stopping them investing in the UK or doing more to avoid that tax, I think is genuinely open to doubt. So whether they could actually raise the 50 billion that they said they'd raise, I doubt.
Yeah, I mean, on the corporation tax figure, they're talking about 19.4 billion by 2020. Corporation tax would rise to something like 26%. On income tax, they're talking about 6.4 billion over the course of the Parliament. But as you indicate, the problem is, you know, the dismal science of economics is not an exact one, is it? And we look at things like, for instance, the Laffer curve, which points to where they're at that optimal, that Goldilocks zone of taxing people is, and there comes a point, the suggestion is beyond that, where actually you start increasing the tax rate, but actually the tax take reduces, and there's an equivalent effect potentially for corporation tax as well. But we just don't know what the effect will be, do we?
Well, I think you know, they would clearly raise additional money with their plans. I mean, they're saying 50 billion. I think the number's probably quite a lot smaller, but it's not zero. So we're not at that point on the so-called Laffer curve. I think what's sort of slightly troubling in a sense is that they're talking about this additional, well, 50 billion of current spending, another 25 billion of investment spending, and giving the impression that other than 2 or 3% of taxpayers, nobody would actually be bearing the burden of that. Well, actually, if they did get that additional 50 billion of tax, then that burden would be spread across the population. In the end, companies don't pay tax. The only people who can pay that tax are either the company's customers in higher prices, or their employees in lower wages, or their shareholders, in other words, anyone who's got a pension, in lower returns on that. So if you look at the overall tax burden, whilst it won't be at all transparent, it would grow pretty significantly.
Paul, how much of an omission is putting a costing on renationalisation here?
Well, if you're looking at the way that we measure government spending and borrowing, the Labour Party are quite right that it wouldn't count against borrowing, because essentially what you're doing is you're using government borrowing to buy shares in those companies of an equal value. So the government isn't any better or worse off as a result. I think the real question with respect to nationalisation is whether those firms would be as well run or better run or worse run in the public sector than in the private sector. Clearly they need to be clear, what scale of money they would need to spend on these things, and the answer is tens of billions of pounds. But they're right, it doesn't count against borrowing as we normally count it. OK, Paul Johnson from the IFS. Paul, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot.
Let's get more now on Labour's manifesto launch. Our political editor Faisal Islam has been speaking to Jeremy Corbyn following his speech this morning and joins us live from Bradford. Faisal, Jeremy Corbyn said that this is about a campaign of hope, not fear. But do the sums add up?
Well, that is a key question. Jeremy Corbyn very happy on home territory here in a Labour seat with a 5-figure majority, presenting it to his core supporters, who were delighted by the announcement of the scrapping of tuition fees if Labour came into government, by a near £50 billion rise in the tax bill, focused, say Labour, on big businesses and the very richest, the 5% top incomes, and 50 billion also in extra spending, including that scrapping of tuition fees, reintroduction of maintenance grants. That's the single biggest spending commitment, but also changes to benefits, extra spending for healthcare, for education, creation of a national care service and a national education service too. A number of crowd pleasers for a home Labour crowd, and fundamentally a stronger role of the government in the private sector, ranging across energy, mail, rail, and also now the water industry too. That was the new announcement. But there was an intriguing choice of priorities for Jeremy Corbyn, that 11 billion of spending on scrapping tuition fees, at the same time, on the day when the inflation figure hit a 4-year high of 2.7%, of certainly not being clear in the documentation that a freeze on working age benefits that costs about £3.5 billion, a cash freeze that George Osborne introduced and it's meant to last 4 years. Certainly the document said that that freeze would be left in place to some degree. In the press conference immediately after the launch of the manifesto, he said, "We are not going to freeze benefits, that is very clear," but that wasn't in the document. So when I spoke to Jeremy Corbyn, I pushed him on that issue, something that could potentially make the difference of 10-12 billion in terms of the costings. This is what Jeremy Corbyn told me a few moments ago. In this document, have you learned the lessons of why Labour lost in 2015? Because some will argue that, although it went down well in this hall, it's the swing voters that you're not hitting just yet.
All the policies we've announced have proved to be very popular over the last week or so, the ones that came out before the manifesto itself. And I think when people get to read or hear about what's in our manifesto, 95% of the population will pay no more in tax, VAT or national insurance, but instead we will get properly funded schools, a properly funded health service, a housing programme that does deal with homelessness, but above all, an economy that is investment-led and grows for the good of all. And we won't have these dreadful levels of inequality in Britain.
So Labour had an issue with economic perceptions of economic competence, but you're asking for even more trust from the public in terms of a government that has a much stronger hand in the state, in rail, in energy, in water. They need to trust you even more than they didn't trust the last Labour
I think
party.
the privatisation of rail, energy and water has resulted in what? Huge increases in water bills, huge increases in rail fares, and has resulted in the public being ripped off, whilst at the same time those companies are paying huge dividends out, paying some fines in the case of water for the pollution that they've caused. Isn't it better to have some public certainty about the vital services we need. We all need gas, we all need water,
so
we all need electricity.
So you're going to cut the bills, you're going to cut the fares.
And we will benefit from the profits that are made as well, as a public.
So you will cut the bills,
well,
you will cut them. What's
the
London
aim...
to Manchester, 50% discount?
No, I'm not. I can't put figures on that, and I don't think you really expect me to. What I'm saying is that if we have water companies that are making huge profits, underinvesting in the infrastructure, in some cases being fined for the pollution they're causing in our rivers, I think we can do things differently and better. Water is publicly owned in Scotland, for example, already.
Can you clarify what is happening with benefits? You seem to suggest down there that the freeze would be lifted, but that is not costed in your manifesto.
The points I was making about benefits are the benefit cap has very perverse effects, as does universal credit, because the problem is that in areas of high housing costs like central London, basically the central areas of most of our cities and some towns and cities like Oxford and Cambridge, that means that the benefit cap means that those who are in private rented sector can't afford to stay there and get moved out because the council doesn't have the resources to pay them a transition amount. And so what we're doing is looking at how we will deal with that. And the issue fundamentally is low wages and high housing costs.
But
low
it's
wages,
not in the manifesto.
well, low wages are absolutely in the manifesto.
No,
We're talking about £10
lifting the benefit
living wage.
freeze, is it costed in the manifesto?
We have not made a clear commitment on that. The commitment I make is that I do understand the issue. I understand the perverse effects of the cap, which is what I made clear in the answer to my question there. And we will be dealing with that in the context of more affordable, secure housing and higher wages through living wage.
Why have you prioritised students rather than people on frozen benefits?
We're prioritising not charging the next generation for going to university, but we're also helping people on benefits by, as I've said, more secure housing, by ending the indignity of the capability to work tests and making them a medical assessment, not a bureaucratic assessment. Things will be very, very different and be a very, very different regime in the DWP.
So Jeremy Corbyn there clarifying that the freeze in working age benefits, the cash freeze, will stay in, but some of it will be compensated by extra payments in terms of benefits. The bigger picture, a big tax rise, Labour say it will fall on the very highly paid people earning over £200,000, paying £8,000 a year more. The economists say, well, hang on, you're trying to raise tens of billions of pounds off about 1 million people and our top businesses. Is that sustainable? Will they change their behaviour in a way that means you'll raise much less than that? Bigger picture, though, I think can be summed up by one phrase that Jeremy Corbyn used in his manifesto launch in relation to the water nationalisation plans, which was, we're going to take back control of water. Jeremy Corbyn there channeling the successful Brexit campaign. He wants to, if you like, incite a kind of populism that saw the Brexit campaign surprise the nation, and he wants to do the same and thinks he can do. Clear blue water between Labour and the Conservatives, but the problem is there's also clear blue water in the polls right now. He hopes that this document can change that.
Faisal, thanks very much. Very good afternoon, it's 3 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. I'm Kay Burley. Our top stories. Labour launched their election manifesto, but Conservatives say the sums don't add up.
This manifesto is a draft for a better future for our country. It's a blueprint of what Britain could be and a pledge of the difference a Labour government can and will make.
Donald Trump admits he gave intelligence to the Russians, saying he had every right to. Ian Brady's lawyer tells Sky News he doesn't believe the serial child killer was withholding information before he died. Police say a 16-year-old schoolgirl found dead in a car after a crash wasn't killed by the collision. They make 2 arrests. And the cost of living rises again as inflation hits a 3.5-year high. Good afternoon, this is Sky News at 3. Jeremy Corbyn has launched Labour's manifesto for the general election with promises to tax the rich more and renationalise key industries. The Conservatives say his pledges aren't costed and business leaders say they give real cause for concern. But union bosses backed him, saying they'd create a Britain to be proud of. Let's take a look at some of the key measures for you. Jeremy Corbyn says his party will renationalise the railways, energy sector And also the Royal Mail. I'm going to move over here and then you can see a little bit clearer. On taxation, no income tax rises for those earning less than £80,000 a year, and no VAT or national insurance rises either. But there would be increases for those who earn more than £80,000 a year. Labour would scrap the Conservative government's white paper plans on Brexit. There would be an extra £6 billion a year for the NHS. The triple lock on state pensions, that would be guaranteed. And tuition fees for students would be scrapped. But a line in last week's leaked draft manifesto urging caution before using nuclear weapons has been removed.
A government that invests for all. A government with a vision to ensure that the brilliance and imagination of every child can be fulfilled during their lifetime. Our proposal is a government for the many, not the few. Our proposals are of hope for the many all over this country, and I'm very proud to present our manifesto for the many, not the few.
Speak to our political correspondent Tamara Cohen, who is in Bradford, where the manifesto was launched earlier on today. Hello to you, Tamara. Very good afternoon. Is this fully costed?
Hi, Kay. Well, that's what Jeremy Corbyn says. We saw a balance sheet with our manifesto, which showed £46.8 billion in and £46.8 billion out. And certainly Labour have not been shy about these tax rises. They want a return, wholesale return to tax and spending, where people who earn over £80,000 a year pay more, companies pay more, companies who employ high earners pay even more. And all of that, Jeremy Corbyn says, will be injected straight into public services, into schools and hospitals to make them a lot better. In fact, a lot of the money is not going into schools and hospitals, it's going into abolishing university tuition fees. That's a very expensive commitment. It would cost £11 billion a year, compared to, say, £5 billion a year, which is putting into the NHS. Labour would also reverse a number of cuts to benefits that we've seen over the past 7 years. So they want to... Jeremy Corbyn says this isn't about class war, it's about creating a better society. But there are questions about the figures that we've got today. The first one is this renationalisation programme that Labour are talking about. Last week we knew they wanted to renationalise the railways and the energy companies. Today they've gone even further, saying they want the water companies as well. Well, these water companies are worth a lot of money. We haven't heard a huge amount from Jeremy Corbyn or his team about exactly how this is going to work. Are they going to print money, essentially? Are they going to buy back those shares through government bonds? Apparently we're going to hear more tomorrow. But in our list of the ingoings and outgoings under a Labour government, those nationalisations are not mentioned at all. Another thing which is not mentioned is when businesses and high-earning individuals face higher taxes, their behaviour tends to change a little bit. They maybe invest a bit less, they maybe move their money elsewhere. Those sort of changes haven't really been set out by Labour in any detail, so we've seen some independent experts saying, hang on, they might not raise quite as much from, say, the income tax rise as they say they will. But in general, Labour say they are trying to cost this out, and they say that this is a stark choice for swing voters. Under Labour, they would essentially see well-off people paying higher taxes. They say a lot more people would benefit. The Conservatives say it's unworkable, and they're hoping that this sort of programme will turn off swing voters. It was interesting, Jeremy Corbyn got a question from one of the audience, and that person got booed, saying that people like the sound of the policies, it's the messenger they have a problem with. Jeremy Corbyn didn't really address that point about his leadership, but certainly Labour MPs I talked to are hearing a lot about that on the doorsteps.
We have not made a clear commitment on that. The commitment I make is that I do understand the issue. I understand the perverse effects of the cap, which is what I made clear in the answer to my question there, and we will be dealing with that in the context of more affordable, secure housing and higher wages through living wage.
Now, that was Jeremy Corbyn speaking to our political editor Faisal Islam, and he was asking him about whether, in the context of a lot of these benefit changes being reversed, he was going to reverse a decision by George Osborne to cap the level of benefits where it is now for 4 years, essentially from 2016. So people on benefits don't see any rise despite paying more for a lot of things. And Jeremy Corbyn there didn't quite commit to doing that, which George Osborne had intended to save a few £billion. So while a lot of reversals to benefit cuts, not all of them.
OK, for now. Tamara, thank you. Lib Dem leader Tim Farron says Labour's policies can't be implemented because of Brexit.
I think the problem Jeremy Corbyn has and the Labour Party has is that any promise, any commitment in their manifesto is meaningless, given that Jeremy Corbyn and Labour voted with UKIP and the Conservatives to take us on the most extreme version of Brexit, meaning that there will not be the money there to afford any kind of progressive policies at all.
Well, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Gauke, said the proposals aren't properly funded.
What is clear and what we've learned today is that Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto is nonsensical. It contains a number of unfunded spending commitments. It contains a number of tax proposals that are likely to damage the economy, damage wealth creation, and feed through into hitting wages. And the reality is that the people who will pay the price for the pledges we've heard today from the Labour Party are ordinary working families who will see their taxes rise. That's the only way the sums can add up.
Let's bring in our economics editor, Ed Conway, who has been looking at how Labour's numbers do add up or otherwise. Hello to you, Ed. So Labour is telling us that the profit and loss do add up. What's your interpretation?
Yeah, and in fairness to Labour, they provided rather a lot of detail, more than most parties tend to in their manifestos. Normally they're relatively vague about how they're going to afford their promises. In Labour's case, they have provided numbers. So let's actually kind of look at within their manifesto. You've got these big tables with lots of numbers on spending and on tax. Just because these are rather complicated, what I've done is I've put them into kind of graphic format so we can have a look at where they're spending and where they're actually raising those taxes. So let's start with spending first of all. And the striking thing is how much money is going to go in these Labour plans, and this is by 2021 to 22, so the end of next Parliament. They are proposing to spend an extra £25.3 billion a year on education. That's things like tuition fees, extra money for schools. That's pretty much, actually, a bit more than half of their total extra spending amount. Interesting, on education. The next kind of big part is health and social care. £7.7 billion on health and social care. Add on the next bit, which is work and pensions benefits, in other words. And it's striking, really, actually, just how little of the money Labour are setting aside here is for benefits, not reversing that freeze that George Osborne brought in, not necessarily doing all that much. £4.6 billion isn't much in the grand scheme of what they're spending overall. And then on top of that, you've got other spending, so things on police numbers, that public sector pay cap is going out. Add that all up and you've got just under £50 billion. How about taxes? Can they raise enough money to make that up? Well, they're saying they're going to raise £19.4 billion in corporation tax. Now, a lot of people would ask questions as to whether you can raise that much on corporation tax, but nonetheless, that's their biggest tax rise. Then we've got the much heralded £6.4 billion on income tax, so extra taxes for anyone earning over £80,000, and indeed a higher. The 50p tax comes back. £6.4 billion, again, question marks over whether it will really raise as much as that. On top of that, you've got lots of other business taxes as well, some things for higher earners within those business taxes. You've got other taxes on top of that, things like VAT on private school fees, and as ever, with pretty much every manifesto, a lot of money raised from tax avoidance measures. That brings you actually to slightly above the amount that they're spending, but then they say there's going to be about £3.9 billion worth of behavioural change. In other words, people shifting money overseas. Some economists would say the behavioural change is going to be much more than that. But when you consider this big bar, more taxes for the UK, how does that make the tax burden in Britain look? Well, we can have a look back over historical, the past few decades, and you can tell that this is the tax burden as a percentage of GDP. So it's the total amount of tax, the money the government is bringing in, divided by the size of the economy. And over the course of the past few decades, since the war, it's averaged out at about 32% of GDP. The existing government plans are to keep it actually relatively high, the highest tax burden since the 1980s. What would Labour plans do to this? So government plans there, what would Labour do? Let's add that on. It would be a big increase in the tax burden, going all the way up to the highest level as a percentage of GDP, so it's historically comparable, the highest level since all the way back in 1949. So this would be an enormous change to Britain's tax structure. Of course, an enormous question, though, is whether they can actually raise that much money.
OK. Ed, for now, fascinating. Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all my